Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Jim Hauke, a former and retired pressman from the Kenosha News for longer than 30 years. Hello, Jim. Thank you for joining me.
Good to see you.
Okay, when did you start working at the Kenosha News?
Well, it was 1951 that I was on the payroll,
Okay.
but I started as a newsboy back in the late 40s.
Okay. And when you started on the payroll, what was your job?
At that time, it was just a truck driver delivering the papers to the kids on the corners waiting for them to do their routes.
Okay, what did they pay you as a payroll employee on driving the truck?
When I started, it was 75 cents an hour. A few months later, I was lucky to get a nickel raise.
Okay. And were you the only person driving a truck to deliver newspapers?
No, we would have at least 8 or so people, and most of them came from high school. Right when their afternoon was done at school, they'd head over to the news, and there were motor routes, as they called them, that people, we had 3-wheeled motorcycles to deliver the papers, and anyways, that's...
Okay. So the Kenosha News owned the vehicles that they drove?
Everything was owned by the Kenosha News.
Okay. And then you drove a truck for how long?
I drove them till I went into the Army till in 1956, and then I was gone for 2 years for my service in the Armed Forces.
Then you came back in 58.
Yes.
Okay, and you went back to the news as a driver again?
Well, as a general worker then, from anything they needed, if it was
Okay. So tell
insulating
me
the attic of the news, or maybe it'd be cutting grass, or you might be painting, anything that
So
needed.
you were kind of a handyman
Right.
around the news and for the owners.
And I wanted to get an apprenticeship, but until my service was done, they wouldn't take anybody. So I pushed up my time to go in sooner so that I could get back. And then I was also engaged to be married.
Okay, so you got out of you were engaged to be married, you got out of the service and got married.
Correct.
Okay. And describe some of the things that you did as a general worker. You started talking a little bit about some of that. Now, there were how many owners of the paper at that time?
At that time, there were 5 owners.
Okay.
But the major person I always talked to or did everything with was Bill Schulte.
Right.
Yeah.
And you worked for him on all kinds of levels.
Correct.
Okay.
Mainly, I was always for the maintenance of the trucks.
Okay.
And when I first started as a paper boy, we only had 4 trucks and we had 3 motorcycles. And they were the 3-wheeled motorcycles that did the close county routes, like Bent's Road to Highway 31. And
So, just like a mail truck, they would drive
yes,
down the road and
yes,
put the paper.
right.
Okay.
And then the other trucks, they went out in the county, and Twin Lakes, Silver Lake, and all that was done and dropped off.
Okay. So, when did you move into the building, so to speak, as an employee?
It was well, I was 1951. I was employed, but it took about a year later before I did get an apprenticeship, and then I was in a composing room. But I liked mechanical things much better, And a year later, it opened up that there was an opening in the press room. And that's where I continued my lessons and all that for being a pressman. And that's where I stayed the rest
of your time.
time.
Okay. So when did you move into the into the composing room? What year was that?
I would say that was 1959.
Okay. And what did you do in the composing room, or what did the composing room do?
Well, that's what put your pages together, and at that time it was hot metal.
Well, it was hot. It wasn't hot metal that you
Well,
handled, but
No,
okay.
but it was hot metal that made all the letters or whatever. When it
Okay.
came out of the linotype machines, and then they were proofread, there was a proof taken of it, and if there were any corrections or whatever.
But then-
I did not work on linotype machines.
But you set
Yes,
the type on a page.
correct.
And how did you have to do that? Did you just didn't line up letters?
It was locked up into a form when all the things, and there were spacers to fill in whatever space so that it was even. You put them in these here iron things, they were cranked tight, then
Kinda
they
like
were
a
slid
frame?
off. Yes, in a frame.
Okay,
And
but-
then it was put on like a cardboard sheet, and that was to make it into a casting for the press, and it fit half of a cylinder.
Now, what was the process of setting the type? How did you had to set every letter?
It all came, what was called like the bank, and all that stuff was carried over on a little tray,
Okay,
and then it was put into the form.
okay. Did you have to read this as you said it, or not?
Might just to follow a story or something
Mm-hmm.
like that, that it had to be in the right place, but no, I didn't have to. There were 3 people that read all the proofs.
Okay. And so you say that this frame of the page, after the type was put in it, created a casting.
It went into a casting, yes.
Okay, and then it created a page that would fit on the press.
Correct.
Okay. And then when you got into the press room about a year later,
Yes.
okay, then what did the pressmen have to do with this casting or this page that
Well,
was?
first after it came down from upstairs, there was called stereotype department, that they were the ones that cast the plates into they had an upstairs where maybe they were casting pictures or stuff onto the thing, because there had to be, they called them lead slugs, and there was one guy just making lead slugs all the time. George Walters, I even remember his name.
And what were the slugs for?
To space out the type
Okay.
when it went into form, so, because every story wouldn't be a perfect match, so you could kind of stretch it out a little bit with a little bit more space or that everything fit.
Okay, so this page went to the press room and had to be put on. Well, this was, you said it was hot metal, which was lead,
Yes.
okay? How was this handled? I mean, was it easy to handle?
Oh, it was awful. When it came out of the machine and everything, even a linotype, it was cool. I mean, they slid it off right into a small tray and could slide it into the bigger
Okay.
form.
All right, so when the page was complete and all of what was in this form was lead, this had to be moved and put on the press?
Right. Upstairs, they had like a roller that would go over the type to cast it on this. It wasn't like a cardboard, but this was a stair. And then it was dropped to the downstairs, and then we had a big metal pot there, and it was a pump handle that pumped this lead into the form with the cardboard, and then it was just cooled, and then that half a plate went on the cylinder of the press, and they weighed then almost 50 pounds
So,
when it was the cast for the
Right.
page on the press.
so each page weighed 50 pounds.
Yes.
And how many pages were common to be put on the press to run the daily newspaper?
Well, it was usually in the 32 page would be a pretty common. I mean, Saturday might be a smaller paper, Fridays, and then like on a Thursday, it's groceries maybe, or so it varied by how many advertisers they had, but a big thing was classified advertisements in those days.
And how many people were in the press room to put all these pages on the press?
We had normally 4 people. I mean, it fed from both ends, the paper on the press. And then the old press, we had a big picture window right on 58th Street, and many people used to like to see that running from the press, and
So they gather at the window.
they'd gather by the window, and of course once in a while you'd know somebody to wave to. So
Okay, so once the pressman put these plates onto the press and started the press running, what was the job of the pressman at that time?
that was setting the ink, and what do you call it? There were all grease things that had to go along, and every cylinder had them for in its bearing like, and you screwed these caps down at least once during the run. And then we had to go along maybe midway with an oil can for the bottom rollers and all that, and they were just opened with a brass fitting and had the hole drilled in there, and you'd have to go along and give it a shot of oil to make it through.
So you had to monitor the
Right.
whole time.
Plus, you had to watch how the roll size was before you changed the roll.
Okay, how did you change a roll? I mean, didn't you start with a full roll and end with a roll without having to change a roll, or?
No, we always had roll changes in a press run. A roll wasn't not big enough. And a roll was, if it was what we call a straight run, it was 16 pages. And I would say that maybe they got 12 to 15,000 maybe off a roll. And it depended how many units are running. So like for a 32 page paper, it might be 4 because you're going to be using 1 unit for color. Normally there was always at least a front page color or something. It might not be a picture as much as just a headline or whatever happened.
Okay. And this was what kind of a press?
It was a Gauss. The early one was a Gauss before that, and we ended up buying a Gauss for the last one. It was an offset printing.
Okay, so what type of press was the one before?
We called it a letter press because it was using the lead.
Okay. Okay, did you have any other job while you were also working in the press room?
Yes, for 30 years, I also, when I got done with my press room, I worked on their maintenance of their trucks, from engines to brakes to paint jobs to body work, which is a job that I liked. Plus, I did all their snow plowing because we even had our own tow truck. And anyways, it was a job I liked.
Any interesting stories about things you
Oh,
had to
yes.
do with trucks? Or
Yes, we had trucks that got rolled over the thing. We had the 3-wheel motorcycle, and one guy made a mistake with the clutch and went right through the garage door in the back with that. Another fella, he wanted to show how fast he could get in the garage, and 2 days in a row he ran into the center post on the garage. And they were all young guys, and so they hadn't been driving that long, but
And then did you have to repair the trucks?
yes, yes,
Whatever needed to be fixed?
right.
So you'd put a new engine in if you had to?
Yes. Or in them days, you don't hear much now, but we'd overhaul the engine. I mean, you'd maybe have to take the block out and it'd have to be milled back into the right diameter, and then we put the pistons in. And in the old trucks, you used to have to set the valves, where now everything has hydraulic valves in it. And so while it's running, you'd sit up there right by the engine with a feeler gauge, and you have to turn those little nuts to make it right, to run right. So,
A lot of that work.
yes.
Did you ever make something out of something else?
Well, I used to, when the trucks were all done, or whatever, I made quite a few trailers by just taking the back end of the thing and welding it back together. And I was instrumental in how we fixed the first tow truck. It was all just iron net that we got, and there was a old crank, which was hard to turn to lift the trucks, but I think it came from St. James to raise something up in their gymnasium. The first one broke. All the teeth came out of it and everything.
So when you first started in the press room, how much were you paid?
I don't really remember how much. I made, when I was buying my first house, so that was close, I made $78 a week at that time. I got $44 for my apprenticeship and $33 for working on their trucks after the hours.
How much time did you spend part-time in the garage or working?
It was usually about 15, 16 hours a week. It would be 2 to 3 hours a night. And if there was something else going on at the press or that, I might not be able to come over there. That's the thing, is they knew where I was anyways.
Okay, was there any safety equipment that was employed in the press room at that time?
Not when we started, but then there was OSHA or whatever starting to say you couldn't make claims or that for hearing or that, and so we did get hearing aids. A big thing in the early press was that they were talking about how much the odor from melting the metal, because every day when you took the plates off, they went on a homemade hand truck thing, but it would be rolled over to the pot. And when you threw that in, they had big exhaust fans trying to get it out, but that was a big complaint of how bad it smelled at times from the smoke and that from the melting of the lead plates.
Okay. And if we go back just a little bit before you started in the press room or composing room, and you worked driving the truck and being a general worker, there were opportunities where subscriptions would be sold to magazines by carriers.
Yes.
And then they would be rewarded.
Right. There was always, after many years or that, it was just a paper, and when I started, it was 25 cents a week. And so a paper boy got 7 cents commission for doing this. So it was a 6-day paper. So I figured you got a penny a day for delivering to a customer, and the other penny was for collecting. And even in those days, you might say, to get your quarter, they didn't have it. You'd still have to come back another time because they don't have a quarter, but that seems not possible nowadays that that could happen. But then when they had the magazine campaign, it was 10 cents a week more, and then maybe you got a subscription to 3 or 4 magazines a month. Okay. And if you sold over 20 of them, there was a rewards of going to either maybe a basketball game, a baseball game, and Bill Schulte always knew the good places to go. And I went to see Sonia Henne, and he took us to a restaurant called Gus's Restaurant, which was a steakhouse in Chicago by the stockyards. And I never had a piece of meat that big at home that it looked like a pot roast to me. But when my wife and I got engaged, I also took her to the same restaurant to tell her what I had that time.
Now, this is because Willis Schulte was in charge of circulation.
He was circulation manager, and then Frank Sisk was his assistant.
Okay. And so that's the kind of thing that he would do for carriers. Was there anything else that carriers could take advantage of?
Yes, if you had so many subscriptions or that, if they sold them, Bill ended up getting a boat for the news, which I always love boats. And I got to take kids if they sold so many out or whatever, and they'd get a ride on Lake Michigan. But I enjoyed the boat as much as the kids getting.
Whatever happened to the boat?
Well, I know it got sold at Fulmer Motors. Everyone said I should buy it, but it had 2 twin 30 Johnson motors on, and I burned more gas than I could afford. So I had to wait, and I finally found a boat for $600 for myself.
Okay, now in 1961, this would be shortly after you joined the press room, the paper was sold.
Yes.
Okay, and who bought that?
Howard Brown.
Okay, and did things change much when he bought the paper?
Not really. What do you call it? Only thing he did say was, how come we got a boat? So that's what made the disappearance of it. And at that time, there used to always be advertisers' picnics and that when Howard Brown came. Well, I put a note in my thing that he eliminated that advertiser picnic because what happened is a lot of the owners never came to his picnic. They'd give the tickets to go to it to one of their employees. But what Howard wanted to do is talk to the person that owned the thing because he was interested in getting ads, not entertaining the employees of another company.
Oh, okay. So you worked in the press room with this letterpress for how long? This letterpress didn't last forever.
The letterpress, I think you had it down when it, in 1974, that's when we got our Cosmo offset. That was the name of it. And it was the first Cosmo to be made because there was another our press, it was called the Urbanite, but that was only like 2 pages wide. And so what the Cosmo was making the thing turn into a press that was 4 wide, just like our old Goss.
So
because it was better for a tabloid pages and all that 2-page Urbanite. So it wasn't big enough capacity for.
So it was a bigger model, is what.
Right,
Okay.
right.
And the tabloid is, what size is that compared to?
Well, it's a 1-page. It's just a 1 full page of the paper, but it's turned sideways. So when you fold it, it's then in a catalog like.
It's like a quarter of a page once
Correct.
folded?
Yes.
Okay, and what was the difference in this offset press compared to the press that was before that?
Because an offset press runs with water going over the type. The thing is, first you put a coating on it. They coat all the plates before they would go into where they were developed. And then when the water goes on there, the type would keep the ink on it, and then the water would keep the other area clean, so all you did see was the type. If the water stopped there, the whole page turns black.
So you're constantly washing off
Correct.
the page.
And if you get a hole in the sock that's on there on a roller, then it would start making a black streak or whatever.
Okay, now the plates were different as well. They weren't these heavy.
Yes, they were. They probably only weighed ounces because they were thin aluminum.
And that made it easier to attach
Yes.
and work with.
Yes. And they were put on low on the press where you really had to get down on your knees to put them on the press. And the old one, you actually walked between the units with the lead, and you could have never got down that low to be holding this 50-pound plate.
Okay, and what did this new offset press allow the paper to do as far as printing?
It was a cleaner, all your pictures and everything are much sharper with that. And then, well, there's a collect and a straight run on them. We normally almost ran collect because it was fast enough to get everything done within an hour and a half or two. But when you're done with that, then you have to wipe all the cylinders down. If you needed to change it for color or how you moved it, it was easier to handle than always.
Okay. Now, we touched on roll changes earlier, but just how much of a job was it to do a roll change on the letterpress? And was it different, harder or easier on the offset press to make the roll change? How did they work?
As far as rolls, they were comparable in how much they weighed anyway. So, I mean, there was like two cables on each side, which one of them pulled up the axle, you might call it, that went through it and went on the press. What do you call it? We set the ink and all that stuff, but we always had our eye how big the roll was before it's going to have to be changed.
And then what actually was the process? I mean, did you wait until the one roll ran out and then put on a new one, or?
And yes, before we didn't have automatic pasters like bigger papers do. And so the press actually stops when you made it, and then we had tape that was a glue, and you just bring the sheet over, paste it down on it, and start. But if you don't have automatic pasters, also wastes more paper before everything gets back in line, because the color in that, the tension's different on the roll. There's like a brake tension on it that you twist it and hold it into the slot.
Okay. And then at some point there were automatic pasters?
They did later get it one or two on the end.
And
that stopped.
That just
Yes.
almost, it happened without even thinking about it.
Yes. Well, you kind of watch for it to slow down because it can miss.
Okay, and if the roll broke, then what?
And that meant redoing the whole thing. And you don't want a web breaker there too, because then the paper will maybe start wrapping around the cylinder instead of going straight. And you could actually, it hasn't happened really, but it would keep building up, and it could actually bust something from getting larger.
So a lot of monitoring to make
Yes.
sure if something happened, it was going to be a minor.
Yes. Although we had some where we were down.
Okay, do you remember any particular challenges with the press? Doing something that you couldn't do, or something that was a challenge to work on the press? Any?
Well, if it came to it that they had to change one of the motors or anything like that, we usually had Goss come and do that. And the reason that Goss wanted to sell the press to Kenosha, it was the very first one of the Cosmo. Chicago wasn't that far away for their plant to come, and whenever they had new customers, they also brought them to our plant to see how it was set up, how it ran.
It was like their first press to show other people what
Correct.
it could do?
Of that model.
How about color? Color became much more prevalent.
Yes, it was hard to do color on the old one because it was just a feeder thing that was down on a bar underneath, and I mean, you had to get down in there and move this thing, where if the more units you had, then the more you could leave color in the same units all the time without doing the change. Mm-hmm. So we had a red unit, like a blue unit, and a yellow. I mean,
And the colors never mixed within those units. They
Correct.
stayed. So,
correct. That was printed over.
Okay, so did you, okay, every day except Sunday for a while, the press ran, a paper came out every day.
Yes.
When the press wasn't running for the daily newspaper, what were the pressmen doing? What was going on with the press at that time?
Well, there was always these rollers too. They were rubber. We'll just call them rubber and that. And you had to watch for them that sometimes they started cracking or whatever. I mean, we always had sets of rollers on a rack that were ready to be changed. We also had to put the sock on that put the water on, and we didn't want to have to do that job when the press went down or was, so you had it waiting for you, and so you were only down maybe 10 minutes or something to change the whole roller or whatever. So.
And were there other things that ran on the press when the paper wasn't running?
Yes, we used to run the Bargainier, we used to run the Zion paper, and then there would be special editions, or if there was a tabloid or something special, that was run before it, and then they had the inserting department out.
Okay, and was there a lot of difficulty switching over from one kind of thing, one kind of product on the press and another? Or
Not
was
really.
It was pretty simple to
Not
switch.
like,
Okay, and again, the Sunday paper started shortly after the new press was put in. And did that create any issues for the press?
well, it did. The people, the guys working, didn't care for the Sunday and that. And then they had quit the Saturday paper for a while. And then there was a lot of complaints there wasn't a Saturday paper. So it went back to it, even though it was a little paper, that it still had the news.
So the press was running 7 days a week,
Yes,
and multiple things were on the press
right.
most days. And
There was a lot of cleaning to be done on the off days. I mean, the press was kept pretty clean or whatever, you know, so.
now initially, the paper did not print color comics for Sunday.
Correct.
Why was that?
Because we were really a unit short for running comics, because it takes the three sides, three on each side, you know, for the color.
Okay.
And the way ours was, it picked up the color from one of them by wrapping it around it. It'd be hard to explain that,
Yeah.
but
So, I mean, I did not, we talk about the press. Well, the press wasn't just one piece of equipment. The press was something more than that. What was
yes, they're called units then. They're all presses, but it's a press unit. And
you
so
need
the
a
more units you got, the more pages you can print at one time.
because you're running through one unit to do one thing and
Right.
coming another unit for something else, and ultimately these units are running pages
Yes. So to run the comics, we got another unit, and we were able to put some extra rollers in, and that got our color on both sides to print comics, because before we had to have somebody else print them for us.
Okay. Was that a challenge to print color comics?
Well, not once it got going, but it was a very long lead. I mean, the longer the lead is, the more the papers can shimmy a little bit coming over the thing, and then that throws out your alignment of all the colors to be together.
Now, is the paper wet when it goes into the unit?
No.
Does it get?
Well, if it gets too wet, it's going to tear. If something would run over the water or something, that would cause a web break.
Okay. So did you make friendships in the press room?
Yes, I did. I made,
Close friendships?
yeah, John Larson and I were good friends. I mean, I took guys fishing. Bob Kaufman was one that, all the way from driving the truck and all that, I was the one always to have to take out new drivers when I was doing my part-time. So they knew how to shift and not ride their foot on the clutch and throw out bearings or burn out the clutch. And so anyways.
So you were a driving instructor for these initial?
Yes, that was when I was done with the other, before you could drive truck, because we did have standard transmissions on.
Did you teach anybody else to drive in your career?
Yes, I used to go with Mrs. Schulte. She always wanted to drive. She always got a ride. She never did never did drive. She drove with instructor with you, but otherwise she did not drive.
Okay. Okay, like back to friendships. Now you said you went fishing with some of them. John Larson was a good friend. You did other things with him.
Yes, well, the news used to have a, what do you call it, deadline club, and what do you call it, there was big picnics and all of that, and it was a good place to work. I enjoyed myself in it.
Did you keep up with people you used to work with once you retired?
Yes, I have several of them or whatever that I still contact or whatever. I made friends with even like the guy when we got the press. He was from the Janesville Gazette, and he came to show us how to offset work before we really got running, and then he wanted to know about Lake Michigan fishing. And Bill Schultes introduced him to me and said, here's the guy that would show you how to fish on Lake Michigan. Well, he wanted to go then, but it was October. And I told him, you have to come in the spring because it isn't too nice already to be out there, plus they're really not running. So he called me first thing in the spring. I took him out. He got 5 fish. He asked when he could come back. And so he was back the next week. He got 7, and then he wanted to know where he could buy a boat. And he did that, and he came in regularly to fish here. And then his son came with his girlfriend and his sister, and they went out fishing. All of a sudden I got a phone call, Jim, you got to call my father. He took it, was in the fog, and he thought he was close to the lighthouse or that, and the boat had a cabin, so he was kind of inside, and he'd step out and listen. And he thought he was a long way away from the thing, but he was by the rocks by Southport. And he gave her the gas, and there was the rocks. He turned sideways and he slid into the rocks, and it went right through the boat. And the Coast Guard had to come with a float ring and float the boat back to the Kenosha Harbor. And he wanted me to do the work of calling his father on what happened.
You said you took people fishing. This wasn't just local fishing. You worked. I mean, some of the people you worked with, you
and went to Canada also with us. And plus, like John Larson, I introduced him, and he went to his first deer hunting ever. And that was the year my dad died. I didn't have somebody to go with. And Bill Schulte told us there was a big snowstorm when it was time to leave. And he says, you got to leave. And I used to have to put all the chains on the truck. In those days, you put tire chains on to get through the snow. And he says, you got to get that all done. I says, okay. So we worked till 7 o'clock at night and left. When we got to Milwaukee, there was no snow at all.
So when did you retire?
I retired in 1998. That's when I bought my 3rd motor home or whatever. First thing I made was it was a camper you tow behind, and I mounted it to a Kenosha news truck with the steering on the right-hand side, which was kind of a wild truck. Then I picked up Van's bottle gas truck, and I moved that thing onto the back of there, which was a nice truck. Then I moved to a truck camper because there was 7 of us in the family. And so I had to make it enough that everyone was able to sleep inside. The first one I had, my girls and wife got to sleep in. Me and my sons slept out in a tent. But anyways, then we moved to that motorhome, and then we went all the way to Florida, putting her every year, towing the car, and I have a daughter in Atlanta, and we made many, many trips. Yeah, I hate to sell it, but that's when gas started going really up.
And so what was the determining factor for you to retire when you did?
I did because you missed a lot of Sundays when events were, or you had to be there. When the other guy that was in charge, if I wasn't, then I had to go in there at 3 o'clock because they started extra early to do some extra runs on Sunday, so it was almost like a double shift thing. And then I'd stay for both of them. And I had to miss most things on Sundays. And so I was 64 years old. Howard says, stay one more year and you'd get full benefits from Social Security. But it hasn't mattered. At least I've been lucky.
And how long were you able to work on the trucks? Did you work on the trucks till the end?
I'd say I was, once the Sunday paper come in, and a morning paper, then I never worked on them anymore because I just couldn't get enough sleep then. So
Did that play a role in deciding to retire as well, or?
yeah, so anyways, it was just time, and I was never sorry.
Thank you for talking with me today.
Okay, I enjoyed talking to you.